Hi, everyone, and welcome back yet again to economics. Um, I guess you'll notice, I just noticed this about myself. Well, I didn't just notice this, I mentioned it before, but every time immediately when my face comes on the screen, I start doing this. So, it acts as a mirror. If any of you are YouTube stars out there, you've had the same thing happen, I'm sure. But in the meanwhile, you can just enjoy a good laugh at my expense. Perhaps it's better to, if I think that I'm not, it's not that I'm vain, it's just that everybody immediately is like, when you see your reflection, you immediately start to fix things about yourself, right? That's a topic for a psychology class, which this is not. So we will get back into economics. So I hope that you were comfortable with everything on the perfect competition side that we talked about. So today we're going to talk about the second market structure, which is monopoly. And I'm so sorry I could not find a monocle. And if I could, I would not be able to see to write notes even if I had one. So I don't have a monocle. I don't have a top hat either. And if I did, that wouldn't fit into the frame very well, because if I'm going to go with a top hat, I'm going to do the Abe Lincoln stovepipe version. I mean, we're not going halfway on this. We're going to go the whole kit and caboodle. So, and that messed up my hair again, didn't it? Oh well. Oh well, it is what it is, right? So anyway, so I didn't have the props for you, but you will still get to enjoy learning about Monopoly. And so without further ado, we'll get started with that. The next session after Monopoly will be the next two, which are monopolistic competition and oligopoly. So you'll have this session is Monopoly, and then you'll have the last two market structures together. All right, ready to go. So let's pull up our handy dandy whiteboard. And if any of you are old enough or have to remember that, I'm thinking about Blue's Clues. I remind myself of that every time. I used to remember, I remember my daughter watching that. But anyway, so here we are. Okay, so Monopoly. And those of you who have no idea why I am talking about a top hat and a monocle, I'm talking about the board game. It did occur to me. I said, surely all of you know about the board game Monopoly. And this is a little bit different. Okay, so this is a little bit different. Monopoly in the board game, you are building a monopoly. So you are building one of these that I'm about to tell you about, one of these types of markets. So for a monopoly, you have one seller and many buyers. All right, perfect competition, you have many sellers, many buyers. This one, you just one seller. That comes from the prefix mono, meaning one. That's why a monocle is one eyeglass, one side. Don't see a lot of use for that, do we? Unless somebody has a fake eye. But anyway, so one seller then, but many buyers. Now, an example that I like to use for this one is your electric company. All right, so think about, as we go through these characteristics, you can think about the electric company and what you know to be true about that. That'll help you. So one seller, many buyers. We can't have more than one seller of electricity, because if you'll look outside, whatever window you're close to, chances are, unless you're watching this out in the middle of nowhere, you're going to see a big group of power lines, large poles and lines going through them and all this stuff. And the reason, so, or if you don't see them, then the other chance is they are buried underground so that a storm won't cause them to go out, which I am extremely grateful for. My neighborhood has them buried underground, and I love that. So, although, well, never mind. So anyway, you have that. Well, if there were more than one competitor in this industry, what would happen is you would have, instead of having one set of power lines, you would have 3, 4, 5 sets of power lines. And the next thing you know, we would all be power lines and covered up in that. And that would not be a pleasant existence for us. So it makes more sense to have one seller. It's also very expensive to get all of that. Another example would be underground transportation. For example, our MARTA, the New York subway. You can't have more than one competitor on those tracks because people don't care. They're going to get on whichever. You would have to have, for competition to work in that industry, you would have to have different train tracks, different underground tunnels for each firm, for each firm. And with that in mind, there's only so much underground space we have. Not to mention, people are very likely not going to care about that. Now, with the airlines, it works. People care about which airline they get on, but mostly because of price and maybe a few amenities. Mostly because of price, and timing is another one. When you pull up, I like to look for flights on Google Flights, and when I look on Google Flights, it'll just pull up, and what's the main thing I look for? Time. First, I look for time. Does it go when I want? And then second, I look for a price after that. So with that in mind, those are the things people are looking at. They're not really concerned as much. Some people are, but about the carrier. All right, so there are no close substitutes for the product. All right, so, and I could underline close in that one because there may be some substitutes for electricity. You could have, you could use solar power or something like that, but nothing that's going to be a close substitute. Nothing that's going to just, really fit the bill. Solar power, for example, that's not going to work in more overcast areas. It works in Florida. Just a fun fact for you that Disney's Epcot Park is entirely powered by solar energy. So it will work in places like that where there's a lot of sun, not as much in other places. Wind power, they've experimented with that, but the noise is bad and things of that nature. So no close substitutes. And there are significant barriers to entry. Now, when we were talking about perfect competition, I said we would talk later about what exactly is a barrier to entry, but there's not any. You just get up and you put your stuff out there, right? Well, for monopoly, it's not that easy. There are a lot of barriers to entry, and so let's see what some of those are. First, just a general definition is that a barrier to entry is anything that prevents new firms from entering an industry or competing within that industry. Now, that's important because you can prevent things from entering an industry. That's one way. Obviously, you're putting up a barrier. The second way is just maybe they enter the industry, but then you do things to cut them off and keep them from being able to compete in that industry. Standard Oil of New Jersey, good old John D. Rockefeller. I'm sure everyone's heard the term Rockefeller. Usually it's synonymous with a very rich person, an extremely, sometimes even the top rich person. And that was based on John D. Rockefeller was the original who built the company Standard Oil of New Jersey. And he really did have a monopoly. He created his own monopoly on the oil market at that time. And we'll talk a little bit about him as we go through monopoly, but we're going to talk more about him when we get into regulation and antitrust. And reserve judgment on him until that point. So that will get some interest. But one of the things he used to do is he used to undercut his competition. He had a lower cost. He was a bigger company, a more established company. New competitors came in, and he would undercut their price and drive them out of business. He used his own cost structure to be able to knock them out of the market, to keep them from competing. But one barrier to entry, others are patents. If you own a patent on something, then you are the only one. You are preventing people from preventing people from being able to compete. All right, I'll let you catch up just 1 second. All right. That works. Sorry, folks, my doorbell went off and I thought it was UPS delivering a package, but I wanted to make sure that it wasn't anything I needed to take care of. Also, this Collaborate, if I ever pause it, it's going to give me, it's a mess. So thank you for that. Okay. Anyway, another thing is gov licenses and regulation. Now, a lot of times, forgive my old cynical self, but I will say a lot of times that is for sale. And that is also used to keep competition out. Some of you have written about that in the extra credit work that I just gave you about the 80s and things of that nature. And so some of you had written about that and that about how some of these government, Congress uses the, anyway, sorry, I got distracted. All right, back in, let me reel myself back in. Okay. Another one is control of resources. All right, so if you have control of natural resources, for example, De Beers is a diamond importer, and so they owned the majority of diamond mines, and that gave them the control of resources. It doesn't matter what Tom Shane tells you, De Beers had control of these resources, and they used that control to create their own monopoly on importing of diamonds. The oil market, again, let's talk about for a minute about OPEC. OPEC played a significant role in the 80s, creating an oil crisis here in the United States. The reason why OPEC did that was able to do that rather, is because they had control of the oil resources. So with control of the oil resources, they were able to decide who gets oil and who doesn't. All right, so that creates a barrier to entry. And then the last one, infrastructure costs. And infrastructure cost, that's the cost of the framework. For example, like we were talking about with the electric company, we were talking about the power lines, or with MARTA with the trains and the tunnels and that type of stuff. That is your infrastructure. So an example, this is the example, and I'm going to write this down for you. Standard Oil of New Jersey, this is Rockefeller. Was able to undercut competitors' price due to his lower costs of an already established infrastructure. Okay, so let's look at gas stations. He already had his gas stations established. He had his gas stations. They were up and running and built and paid off and all these things. He had the pipelines. He had the refineries. He had all this stuff. He was able to process the oil. He already had that in place. So you have a competitor come in and establish a gas station. Well, number one, it takes a lot of money to build the refinery and all that network to go along with it. Rockefeller already had that. Most competitors would have to go at a slower pace because they didn't have the financial resources as well. So he was able to undercut competitors' price, drive them out of business. Actually, what he did was, after he drove them out of business or crippled them, he would buy their gas stations. Now that brings up, and here's actually something to ponder. Is that actually unfair competition, or is that just the way business should be conducted? Is that just being a good business person? Now that's something for you to ponder, and you'll have a little bit of time to ponder that before we get to regulation, but that is something. But anyway, he would do that, and that's a barrier to entry. So he created his own monopoly there. Nowadays, things are much, much different because, finances, There's easier ways to borrow money. There's more, well, there's actually more wealthier people around these days. So if you want someone, an investor or something of that nature, it's easier to find. So it's a lot easier than it was back then, which will bring me to something else, but that's later. We'll just whet your appetite on that. All right, so here are some facts about monopoly, demand, and supply. All right, so number one, market demand equals the firms or the demand Okay, so the market demand is the same as the firm or the monopolist demand since they supply the entire market. That's an easy one. It is downward sloping, which means the law of demand still applies. Now you will remember that the law of demand says that when prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. Now you would think for a monopolist that would not be true, that they could just charge whatever price suited their fancy and people would just have to buy. But remember, demand is what people are willing and able to pay. So the higher a monopolist would set their price, the less people have the ability to continue to purchase. So I would go so far as to say monopolists have some of the same price constraints as regular competitive firms. All right, unlike perfect competition, marginal revenue does not equal price, but marginal revenue is less than price because they set their own price. So what I mean by that, their marginal revenue is equal to price because they set their own price and their numbers just add up differently. And also because they are price makers, which is what I just said, they have the market power to set price. And then the last one is they have no supply curve because they are only supplier. So they have no supply curve. They're the only supplier. They can set their price so that, and their numbers just work out differently. So their marginal revenue is less than their price. We'll see that on the graph coming up next, as a matter of fact. So you have that to look forward to. And the law of demand still applies. So that'll give you a little bit of facts about monopoly. All right, so without further ado, let's draw that gorgeous graph. And we're going to call, this one is called Monopolist's Pricing Model. Okay, so we're going to stack them on top of one another. We're going to stack two graphs to show us a couple of things. This is the monopolist pricing model. So the first one look like this. And this one is going to give us the price per unit right there. And here we're going to have the quantity. And then down here, let's draw another one. And we'll also have quantity on that side. But up here, this one's a little different. It's going to have total sales. All right. So up here we're looking at individual units, and down here we're looking at total sales and stuff. And you'll see what I mean with that. All right. So let's look right here. There is our demand curve, and marginal revenue is going to look, well, I drew it a little too far. I went too far with it, but that's all right. We'll let it go. I just got carried away, didn't I? So this is your marginal revenue. You can stop it right about here if you want. We just wanted to show there's a point where it goes below the axis. All right. So I got carried away and just kept drawing. All right. So there's that. And then up here we have this is your total revenue. All right. You can see let's see if I want to make this a different. Yeah, let's do a different color. So there's a point right here on the demand curve that you are aware of where things are unit elastic, right? And then you'll know over here, which is not a good bracket, but it's elastic at the top and at the bottom. All right, that one's a little better, right? It is inelastic down here where the price is lower. All right. Now, if you look from that point for unit elastic, you can look and see, draw a line, and see that it's supposed to be, like I said, I got carried away, supposed to be right there. All right. Or I drew my unit elastic, it needs to come to the side there. Okay. So anyway, it's supposed to be right here. There we go. All right. It's not easy to draw this with these, well, anyway. Okay, so you can see that right here, right where the unit elastic point is, it comes down to, that's where marginal revenue is equal to 0. So you could, or marginal revenue equals 0 at unit elastic. There we go. And also at the unit elastic, you can see that that's the also where total revenue is highest. So let's come over here then and let's take a look at things. So what we want to do as monopolists, well, as any firm really, our goal, ultimate goal, is to maximize profit, right? Now we're going to look at that. Now profit, you will remember, is total revenue minus right? So if you want to maximize your profit, you've got to get this going up, that to increase, and that one to decrease, okay? And that's the only way to get profit to increase. So you want to maximize your profit. Now eventually, okay, so this is this part of the graph, this part of the graph that we've got, we're going to add cost curves in, but right now, this one is to look at the first part of that goal. So you have goal number 1, which is to maximize your total revenue. So what we know is that marginal revenue is less than demand. Marginal revenue is less than demand. We know that marginal revenue equals zero at maximum total revenue. We just put that over there. And we know where demand is elastic, marginal revenue is positive, and total revenue is increasing. All right, so where demand is elastic, we know, let's look right here. Where demand is elastic, marginal revenue is greater than 0, so it's positive, and total revenue down here is going up. All right, so we know that. And the last thing we know is that where demand is inelastic, marginal revenue is negative, and total revenue is decreasing. Okay, marginal revenue is negative, total revenue is decreasing. All right, so we know that. Inelastic right here, marginal revenue negative, total revenue decreasing. All right, good enough. So if we were to sum that up, we could say, therefore, to maximize profit, monopolists must price in the elastic portion of their demand. So to maximize your profit, monopolists have to price up here. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? They're going to want us up there. That's the higher prices. And if you were a monopolist, you would want to price where it is the highest, wouldn't you? As high as you can get away with. But now you also have to keep in mind, that as you price up, your quantity is going to be decreasing also. So there's a point where you don't really want to go way up here. But we're going to add cost curves in, and we will see what that means. All right, and let's do that. So our second goal then, goal number 2, is to minimize costs. All right, goal number 2 is to minimize costs. We want that to come down. So we know that golden rule the golden rule is that the profit maximizing point is, I'm going to give myself room to draw graphs, is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We saw that, the proximizing point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we want to look for that. And we also want to look through where total revenue, total revenue greater than total cost at the highest point. All right, so that's what we want to look for right there. We want to look where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and total revenue is greater than total cost, but at the highest point because we want to maximize here. All right, so let's draw these graphs back again. You can just use the ones you already have, but for me, I'm going to have to draw it again. Price per unit and quantity. All right, and then let's draw this here. Getting a little better at this, I think. Do not leave me an email to tell me any differently, okay? Let me have this one. All righty. So now this is a fun graph to draw. I always love drawing this graph. I always have to adjust it. So let's see what we got here. All right. So let's go with our demand curve first. All right, and then marginal revenue. All right, and then down here, let's do total revenue. This one's already looking better, isn't it? Okay. All right, now we got to add in some costs, don't we? So let's get some different colors here. How about average total costs for green? All right, average total costs. Let's get some marginal costs going here. Oh, knew that was going to happen. There we go. All right, and then let's see. Go down here, what color do we want to do? Let's do a gray down here because that's a pretty color. And your total cost. Now your total costs look a little bit wonky, kind of, but that is the way it works. And I'll explain just a second. Let me see if I can draw this one first. There we go. All right. Okay, now that's kind of lovely, isn't it? All right, so what we've got here, the reason why your total cost, it starts out because when you are building a business, it's going to cost you more at first before your revenue starts reeling in because you've got initial supplies and things like that. Just like, think of it this way, if you move out on your own and you stock a kitchen, you're going to have to buy things like salt and ketchup and all those condiments, but you're not going to buy those every week. You know, you'll get a container of salt and it'll last you quite a while. So you have an initial outlay at first that's a lot, and then after that, you know, it takes a minute before you have to do that again, or before you need to expand your plant size or something like that. So you're in good shape right here. All right, so let's look at what we were going to do. Let's look at how we would price that. What color do we want to use for that? You know what? We'll just do black. I was going to do purple, but I think we need black to show up. All right. So we want to see if we're marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So right there it is. All right. There's marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And we're going to call this point C. All right. Well, I've got a little thing there, but it's just point C. Okay. So now you need to, all right, so your price, you could set your price right there. So if you were to do that, you bring it over to the side and that's a price. But but your demand is up here. So what you do, you start with marginal revenue, marginal cost, and then you come up and you find that corresponding point on the demand curve. That, therefore, is your price. And that is not just your price, that is your profit maximizing price. And we're going to call that point A. All right, and we'll see why I'm doing that in just a moment. All right, now let's go down and let's not, all right, so far so good, and we'll see why in just a minute, but let's go down to this one. Let's go down to the next graph. All righty. All right, so let's look right here. Right here you have got, and we're going to call this point D. And I'm going to do this line. Now I know this looks like I'm just self-servingly, but the truth is, if you were to look at my notes and see, it's supposed to come up like that for total cost. That is right there. All right, it's supposed to come up like that for your total costs. That's the actual. So it's not self-serving, it's just hard to draw on these things. Okay, so if you look right here, point D. So let's take a look. Let's label these points and see. So at point C, what we've got here is that we've got marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which is your profit maximizing. All right, so at C, let's label these. These are your points. All right. All right, so at your point C, you have profit maximizing. So we've got that goal covered. A, at point A, you've got price greater than average total costs, which is also profit maximizing, all right? So that meets the criteria. When I'm writing profit maximizing, we're meeting the criteria. So here at A, there's A, and there is your average total cost. So you're covering your average total cost. So you're in good shape there. So A is a good one. Okay. So that's a good one right there. Now let's see, what's the next one? So let's come down to D. And at D, we have total revenue greater than total costs, which also meets the criteria for profit maximizing. So come down here and look. You've got total revenue greater than total cost. All right. So profit maximizing. So right here, all of this. Now let's say, what if you went up here and priced? So somebody's saying, you know what, I can't get beyond the fact that, you know, you're a monopolist, you could price up here if you wanted to. All right, well, let's see what happens if you did that. All right, so we're gonna do that. Let's price up here almost at the highest possible point. All right, so let's see, there's your P right there, and let's go down. Let's see. All right, so let's see what happens. Okay, so you can, right there, you're setting your price there. Well, the way a monopolist costs work out, your average total cost, see, is over here. So you've got to be inside this line here, this curvy line. You've got to be inside there to be covering those costs. You're not inside there, you're outside there. So you're not covering the costs at all. So coming on down here, you're not, and see why? Because you're not making enough quantity. Your quantity would be right here for your profit maximizing. You're losing that much quantity, and see, anything from here, you know, you could probably make it to about right there with the price. But even so, you come down here and look, your total costs are higher than your total revenue. You are not making enough in terms of quantity to cover that initial outlay expense. Now, will it change? Absolutely, it'll change. And as your business grows, your business will grow, and you will get more. You'll make more money, and you'll have less of those total costs. And at that point, maybe, yeah, you might raise your price. But at that point, also, you might have had competitors entering the market. And when you have competitors entering the market, that's going to change the game again. And like I said, conditions today are very different from conditions back when good old John D. built his monopoly. Okay, so that's why monopolists wouldn't price at the highest possible price. So I'm going to why wouldn't monopolists set price at the highest possible? And because, and so this is in orange, so we're going to look at that. One is that your total costs, and this is a big one, is greater than your total revenue. And two is price is not, or well, let's see, price is less than your average total cost. All right, so you're hitting it. Now, are monopolies guaranteed profit? No, they're not guaranteed profit. New technologies come in, for example, patents might expire. New technologies, for example, IBM. IBM had a monopoly on technology until Apple and Microsoft came along and almost bankrupted the joint. To give IBM credit, they got things turned around and they figured it all out and ended up, coming back. But that doesn't always happen. The United States Postal Service is another one that has new competition, and not just with FedEx and UPS, but now people are paying their bills online, different things like that. And so that's causing, they're not quite bouncing back as fast as, technology is going. So that's giving them some issues. So would a monopolist ever shut down? Of course, if they fail to have profit. And that's what brings me to it, that something that I'd hinted out earlier, that monopolists definitely, I think that monopolies, they certainly can break down over time, and most times they do. New competition will come in and break them down over time. So it is very, very rare. In fact, I can't think of one right now. I'm sure there are, other than what's called a natural monopoly, like we were just talking about with the electric company and underground transportation, that by its nature, the infrastructure, it needs to be a monopoly. But otherwise, most of them do get broken down over time. All right, so let's look at how monopoly pricing affects consumers. All right, so let's look right here for just a second. You remember when I told you about consumer surplus? So you have, here's the demand curve, and let's say this is price. Now there are some who are willing to pay that price and some who will not pay that price. They're down here. But then there's some up here. If you're charging this price, then you will sell a corresponding quantity, but there's some that are up here that are willing to pay more. See, they're represented by this part of the demand curve. So those folks can buy this at a lower price, and they can get all this in here, remember, is their consumer surplus. All right? So you remember that. So they get consumer surplus. Now, that's fine, but in a monopoly, a monopolist, since they have this market power, they want to be able to capture. They want to be able to capture the consumer surplus, okay? So they want to be able to do that, so they try to engage in something called price discrimination. And price discrimination, this is to capture consumer surplus. Producers charge different prices to different consumers for the same goods. All right, so they charge different prices to different consumers for the same goods. Examples of that would be airline tickets. For one thing, they'll charge a higher price. If you have to go, if you cannot be flexible about the dates you travel, you pay a higher price a lot of times. If you can be flexible, I was traveling once and I was going to see some family in Florida. So I was just going to fly down because you can get those really cheap flights at the time, and I believe. But anyway, so I was flying down, and what I did, I left on a Thursday. I flew out, and then I looked to see, can I fly back, and so on Sunday, if I flew back, it was going to be $160 more than if I flew back on Monday. So I said, okay, got some vacation time. I'll just stay an extra day. So I was going to fly back on Monday, and that would have been a $60 flight. But then I looked at Tuesday, and it was $40 for that flight. And so I thought, what the heck? Let's just stay till Tuesday. So that's what I did. So because I was flexible, I got a lower price. Movie theaters, amusement parks, all these amusement parks, Disney is playing around with their pricing, and they're starting to charge more on peak days than they are non-peak days. And they're doing this more of crowd control than they are to try to capture consumer surplus, because the crowds have gotten just on the weekend has gotten to where they know their guests aren't having a good time with so many people there. So they want to make sure their guests have a good experience and want to come back. To do that, you can't have as many guests. So, they can't spend all day standing in line waiting for one ride. They've got to, kind of make it where the crowds aren't that bad. It's a real problem for them. So it's kind of like treating things like an eBay auction. It's not always that easy for a monopolist to do. Kind of look at time and other factors that go into the purchasing decisions. Now they can do this because they have something called market power, which I just mentioned to you. And this is the ability to raise your price without losing customers. All right, so the ability to raise your price without losing customers. And obviously monopolists have that because there's nobody else. They can't take their business elsewhere. There is no elsewhere. They could also restrict supply. Other firms can restrict. Monopolists can just set their price. Other firms can restrict supply and do different things to drive up the price. At these levels, marginal revenue does not equal marginal cost. However, therefore, production isn't optimal and efficient. So what I'm saying, therefore, is if you'll go back to the beginning and remember, they are inside their production possibilities curve. Okay, now this is the underlying theory behind regulation and where it comes from. Although Adam Smith, the laissez-faire guy, was saying that that's not necessary because the market will self-correct. Eventually they'll notice they're not optimal, and consumers will start, new firms will come in, different things will happen, and therefore things will go back to the optimum level. That it really, the market itself wants to reach that optimum level, and they whatever they need to do to get there. All right, so that gets us through monopoly. The next class will be it'll cover the last two. They will go a lot faster than this one because they're a blend of the first two that we talked about. Every one of them, there's some kind of blend there. So they'll go a lot faster, and that should get us through market structures. So I hope you have, until we meet again, until next time, have a great morning, afternoon, good night, and I will see you then.